what I'll do is I'll quickly introduce myself and then pass on to Alan and Tim to give a quick introduction to themselves as well. So my name is Jack Francis. I'm the managing director of Pogo Studio. I've been working in partnership with Tim in NHS Lothian and Alan at Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland for the past couple of years now on a number of solutions. Yeah, I'll just quickly pass on to Alan to introduce himself, and then we can go around to Tim.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alan, interim chief executive. Been with the charity now since 2019. Lots of grand plans, and then the pandemic that changed all those things. So yeah, interesting time. Been around the sector for a number of years. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Great, thanks, Alan.
Hi, I'm Tim Walsh. I'm an intensive care consultant by trade, and I'm the Director of Innovation for NHS Lothian, which has led to my involvement in this project.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Tim. So just kicking things off, just to go a bit into everyone's background. Alan, exploring your background a bit, you trained in business administration and then worked for Scottish Government and PwC. So what led you to move from this path and then into healthcare, and specifically healthcare in the third sector?
I actually trained as an accountant. I've got an MBA, but I trained as an accountant. Worked with an American wine and spirits company in London after uni for a number of years, and then kind of joined the NHS as part of the move to trust states in Scotland back in the early 90s. Initially as an operations manager for the New Heart Transplant Unit in Glasgow Royal. So I came with very little experience and was thrown into deep ends. Really exciting time, and that led to a number of opportunities, eventually working with the Scottish Government. I think it was in 1999. I spent a few years working on bringing in some of the learning around process re-engineering, the work that IHI were doing in the States, and Peter Holm and the team were doing in Leicester as part of the team in Scotland. We were bringing that learning into the NHS. And that gave me a bit of exposure across the country. And then an opportunity was, I think it was 2001, to join PwC as a consultant. Stayed there for 5 years. Loved it. It was a really good time. But I guess for me, there was always something missing. All of that. Like lots of us who join the third sector, lots of us who join the NHS or the BS, you know, it's that sense of value, that sense of want to do something that we feel personally as a value. And I had some personal reasons for wanting to give something back. And a job arose with Macmillan Cancer Support in Scotland. And I'd probably come to the end of my time at PwC, look for something else, and decided to make the jump into the third sector. Best thing I ever did. I was 40. It was probably my best career decision ever. Loved it. Continue to love the third sector. Was with Macmillan initially as the general manager for charity in Scotland, then moved across to UK director for about 8 years. So I was flying out in London for about 8 years. And yeah, loved the organisation, loved everything it was doing. We were a big beast in the field, so you got really loved that, if I'm honest with you. We kind of threw our weight about quite a lot and enjoyed that, if I'm honest. 2019 decided I spent a lot of my life living in hotels in London. I wanted to move back to Scotland, and the job with Chest, Heart and Stroke came up. I jumped into that. And again, as I was saying at the start there, came in at first to kind of rewrite the services strategy for the charity. Done that, and then the pandemic hit. So we had all that in the back burner while we worked out whether or not the charity were going to survive over the course of it. And there's done some good things, I believe. One of them was the relationship we built up with yourselves in NHS Lothian. And initially our response, I think, to the pandemic was thinking that our colleagues in respiratory were going to be the heaviest hit. And a lot of the work that we've come to, I guess, grew out of those conversations we had across the country with boards about how can the charity add their weight and support to take the pressure off with the COVID pandemic. And that led to, I guess, where we've got some NHS and Lothian about the third sector seeing itself as a component part of the solution in the long term. Yeah, that's my background.
Brilliant. I think, one thing that the pandemic's certainly pushed forward is the kind of cooperation of organizations like ours. So, you've got a tech startup like ours, a third sector organization like yours, and then NHS Lothian have worked together on this project, I would say, really well over the past few years. So I think the pandemic definitely accelerated that. And on to Tim, another really interesting career from yourself. What led you to initially train as a doctor and then to go on and specialize in anesthetics and then kind of move again into research and innovation?
So to be honest, my decision to do medicine in the end was largely influenced by meeting a sort of inspiring older guy when I was traveling when I was 18, who was a doctor, and I thought he was really cool. So I sort of made a snap decision that that's what I would do, because I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I never regretted it. So that's how I got into medicine, really. Well, I did sort of training in general medicine and went abroad, worked in Africa for a year, actually, just after I graduated. And when I was in Africa, had to learn to do a lot of anesthetics, having never done it before, because that's what you had to do. It was in South Africa, in a rural area. So I got interested in anesthetics then. I'd always planned to be a kidney doctor, but when I came back, I realised I was more drawn to anesthetics, and I just enjoyed specialties that you did stuff with your hands, were very sort of practical. So I ended up training in anesthetics and intensive care. I've been a consultant in Edinburgh, initially in the NHS since 1999. I was initially an anaesthetist and intensive care doctor, and I did liver transplant anesthesia, which was very exciting at the time. And then I always wanted to do research, so built quite a big research program around Edinburgh, and then made the decision when I got the opportunity to move to work in the university. So I moved to the sort of professorship of anesthesia in 2011. So I've been there for the last 10 years or so. So I mainly do clinical research, clinical trials, data-driven research. That's the sort of thing I do, mainly in intensive care. I became R&D director for NHS Lothian about 7 years ago now, and was that during COVID. And that role morphed into also include innovation as that evolved across Scotland and the Scottish NHS. And then about 18 months ago, we decided to split the roles of R&D director and director of innovation. So I carried on as director of innovation, and one of my colleagues is now R&D director, because they're both quite big portfolios. So that's me, really.
Brilliant. It's so interesting how just, a conversation while traveling can have such an impact on your life, and then obviously lead to so much being achieved. So on to long COVID, initially, after the initial burst of COVID, we'll say, we thought we'd got through it, and as a country, we're looking like we were able to move on and get back to normal. But then this kind of long COVID has really sort of crept up on us. So Tim, from a clinical point of view, could you just describe to us what long COVID is and how it has an impact on people's lives?
Yeah, so long COVID is probably what you'd really call a syndrome rather than a disease. And what I mean by that is it's no less important by not calling it a disease, but it's a syndrome because it involves lots of different things. It can have lots of different symptoms to combine into that condition that we're calling long COVID. Some people prefer the term post-COVID syndrome, perhaps to make it more clear that it is something that happens after COVID to some people and can involve lots of different features. So definitions have been created now, just so that everyone's talking about the same thing. So I think most people would now consider long COVID or post-COVID syndrome to be something that's lasting more than about 3 months after having your acute COVID infection. What do we know about it? Well, we don't actually know yet what causes it in terms of the actual processes in the body that cause it. There are various theories, including whether you still have virus in your body, whether it's due to sort of ongoing changes in your circulation and sort of little clots forming. None of these have been proven yet. And most likely it's probably caused by a number of different things, which we don't fully understand yet. And there's a lot of research going on. In terms of its features, I think, as I'm sure all people on the webinar will know, it has a wide variety of features, and they're very individualized depending on who is experiencing them. So they range from physical features, the commonest ones being fatigue, breathlessness. You can have particular features that I think we all recognize and some of us may have had, like loss of taste, loss of smell. You can have skin features, you can have gastrointestinal features. There's a whole host of physical features. what we recognize is that many people, even though they have symptoms, if you investigate, at least with the techniques we have at the moment, you often can't demonstrate an actual problem with x-rays or various physiological tests. It's often very difficult to demonstrate something on testing, but we know that the person is suffering from a problem. The other very important area is effects on your mental health. So we know that some people can have increased risk of depression and anxiety and even traumatic memories from their period with COVID, or things that have been widely called brain fog and just not being able to think as well as you could before. So the bottom line is it's a whole spread of symptoms which affect each person individually, and for which at the moment we don't have any widely proven treatments for long COVID, in the sense that you would know exactly what drugs to give someone with a heart attack or a pneumonia. So a lot of what we're looking at the moment is supportive and self-management approaches that we know work to manage symptoms, in the hope that those symptoms and those problems will gradually resolve over time. The final thing I'd probably just add is when COVID started, I think we had a widely held belief that the people who would get long COVID or post-COVID syndrome would be the people who end up really sick in hospital. But what we recognize now is that that's not the case. And you're probably potentially as equally at risk, or certainly at major risk, whether you had COVID in the community and were never near a hospital, and even if you had COVID with very few symptoms as well at the time. So it's a complex condition that we're learning about, but we don't yet know how best to manage. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Tim. And Alan, could you talk us through your experience of long COVID and how Chest Heart and Stroke Scotland has approached this issue? Sorry, Alan, I think your mic keeps cutting out. I can't hear you very well, unfortunately.
I'm going to move closer.
Thank you.
Better?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I think back in March, April 2020, as an organisation, we were thinking, what does this mean for us? How can we support? And initially, I think we made the assumption, as a lot of people did, that, although it's been proven wrong, is that COVID was going to be primarily a condition that would fit within the respiratory world. We had reached out to respiratory leads in a number of boards across the country to say, look, is there anything that we can do as an organisation? Is people still struggling to hear me? I see a hand up there. Apologies, I can't do any more unless I put my mouth right over. I'll try and speak a bit better. So we made the assumption that COVID would fall within that respiratory one. And I guess that from experience over a number of winters where respiratory teams would struggle with demand, we assumed that the greatest pressure was going to be on respiratory teams, both the acute sector and community. Our advice line team had already ran a bit of a pilot, the team in Raigmore, to provide some discharge support over the telephone for people with COPD, both to support them during, I can lend you headphones, Sophie. Is it that bad? Do I need to put a pair of headphones on? How's it sounding, Jack?
You're fine for about 75% of the time, and then you just cut out. So it's quite difficult to make out something what you're saying.
Sophie, you want to bring them in? I'm more than happy. Sophie's just sitting right there.
You could try turning your video off while you're speaking, Alan. Maybe let's see if that helps, maybe.
Okay, is that any better?
Possibly. Keep going and we'll let you know.
Thank you very much. Bear with me, guys. Any better?
Hello?
Any better?
No, I think it's actually worse.
I'm sorry, I'll try and speak up even more than I normally would.
Thanks, Alan.
Okay, so we were saying we assumed that the greatest pressure on NHS would come through respiratory teams. As I said, the advice line team, our nurses who provide clinical support and advice over the telephone, already done a bit of a pilot with respiratory team in Raigmore, where we support people with COPD to manage during exacerbation, but also the aim was to mitigate against readmission. And the pilot had gone well, and we felt there was a model in there that we could use, that we could apply to long COVID. So that led to a number of conversations across a number of boards about how the third sector could add value. I think what we knew from the outset, we weren't here, I guess, to take over responsibilities that were the responsibility of the NHS. It was additionality where we could add value. It was, I guess, ensuring that by taking pressure off to provide a route where people could get a bit more advice and support on how to deal with the practical, social, emotional, and physiological impact of the condition, that allowed clinicians to work at the top of their license, ensuring they were focusing on the more complex cases. And that is I would say, a relationships across a number of boards that continues to this day, independent of COVID, but we're actually working with the respiratory teams as part of that. That's led to a whole set of other opportunities for us. I think one of the relationships we built was with NHS Lothian and Tim, and although those conversations started around how we could support people to make the transition from ICU, out of ICU back to home, it led to, I guess, a broader conversation when it became clear that the majority of people are presenting in the community. How could the third sector, the NHS, and in this case POGO, continue to provide support? And that led to an opportunity, I think it was Tim God 2021, where we presented our ideas to the then Cabinet Secretary, Dean Freeman. And that was based on a kind of parallel route where people were accessing clinical advice and support through their GPs as appropriate, so that diagnosis and treatment would be something that could run alongside and in parallel with any support that we could provide as a charity, to give people a bit more time to explore what was going on with them emotionally, psychologically, and then provide a bit of support to help them understand their condition and put them in a better place where appropriate to begin to manage their condition. A lot of that focused on fatigue and brain fog, all those things that we know that will come out of it. And that was primarily done through our nurses and AHPs and advice line, but increasingly that's broadened out to the wider CHSS team. So that initial response was given through the advice line, and then where people wanted it to be referred on to other services that we could provide as part of it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alan. So POGO Digital Healthcare, Chest Heart Stroke Scotland and NHS Lothian have been piloting and developing a new clinical pathway to support people with long COVID living in Edinburgh and Lothians. And I know a lot of you will probably be aware of the pathway, but for those who aren't, I'll quickly share my screen. This could be technical challenge number 3. I'll quickly share my screen and show you a video on what we've been developing. So is everyone able to see my screen currently on the YouTube? Brilliant.
POGO Digital Healthcare have created MyTailoredTalks, a web application that provides patients with tailored medical information based on the results of self-assessment questionnaires. Currently in use in a pilot project at NHS Lothian, MyTailoredTalks is an innovative and user-friendly way of getting personalised medical information to patients whilst reducing the burden of administration for GPs. The app works by setting patients up with self-assessment questionnaires to identify any health and social issues they may be struggling with. At the end of the self-assessment, the system automatically provides patients with tailored talks relevant to their individual answers. Tailored talks are short, digital presentations filled with clinically approved medical information suitable for distribution to patients. In partnership with Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland, MyTailoredTalks provides an entry point into the new support services for long COVID, with patients being able to request a callback from Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland advice line. This leads those patients who need it into a 12-week programme of support and advice for their condition. At the moment, MyTailoredTalks provides information and self-assessment for patients with long COVID. However, the app has been built with the future in mind and can be easily expanded to provide tailored talks for other conditions. For more information on tailored talks and POGO Digital Healthcare, visit our website at pogodigitalhealth.com.
Just stop sharing my screen quickly and we can continue with the questions. So Tim, it'd be great if you could just talk us through the pilot project, what you and your team did and what you were hoping to find from it.
Yeah, so this has been a real team effort between the three organisations, and an awful lot of people have contributed to unpicking the many blocks that can happen. So we probably don't need to go into a lot of detail today, but to do a joint project between a commercial company, the NHS, and a charity brings a lot of challenges with digital sharing of data, getting the approvals for that, assuring that people's data are safe, and actually doing the actual logistic practical connections that allow referrals and sharing to occur digitally. So we achieved that, and we set that up in the first 6 months of this year with a lot of work from a lot of different people. So I think the key achievement we've made, or some of the key achievements we've made, have been essentially enabling a GP seeing a patient with long COVID to refer a patient into this pathway in the same way and with the same simplicity, and requiring the same short amount of time as if they were referring a patient, say, for a hernia repair or varicose veins or even something more serious. In other words, it's the same as their routine practice. And the aim is to take pressure off the GPs who are very busy and who at the moment are dealing with many patients and many different challenges, and way beyond obviously long COVID themselves. So once that referral has occurred, the onboarding onto the platform, the idea is that a lot happens immediately then. So once a patient consents to have their data shared and be onboarded, they are immediately offered in their own time to do their own self-assessment. And this is a tool that's similar to the ones that are widely recommended and validated across the UK. And they're largely around what symptoms are you having, what problems are you having, and assess how severe they are. On the basis of that, people then immediately receive that digital support, which, as the video highlighted, can be viewed in their own time, at any time, in a secure space, and digested. And there's also signposting to other trusted resources. So the idea is that people see that that is a trusted resource and it's been created by healthcare professionals. And we're doing some further development on that. And that's what occurred in the pilots. We had about 26 general practices across the Lothian area, and we had around about 130 people referred by those general practices over a period of around 3 or 4 months. And what we have done is then had an ongoing evaluation of how that has worked. Once people are on the platform and have received that self-management advice, all they have to do, if they'd like support from chest, heart and stroke, is literally click a button. They just have to click a button saying, I would like to be called back. And then they will then receive a call back from the advice line, and Alan may say a little bit more about that. So I won't say any more about the detail of what then happens beyond what he's already said. And then a really important thing from our point of view is at the end of that 2 or 3 months, we will summarize what's happened, what the person's symptoms were, what information they were sent and have received and still have, and what support they were given from chest, heart and stroke, and perhaps what additional support they've been offered or referred onto, including things like peer support. And then that is summarized on the platform and also fed back to the GP. So the GP has that information. So if the patient goes back to see them, they have an awareness of what's happened and can hopefully focus their efforts on additional things. I'd probably just highlight that we recognize that some people with long COVID need to see a consultant in a hospital. But we know at the moment that seems to be a relatively small proportion because we don't have proven treatments for many of these frustrating conditions or frustrating symptoms. But the role of the GP is, first of all, to be sure there's not a clear medical condition that they think that patient needs to, for example, urgently see a chest doctor or a cardiologist or someone to help them with their mental health, for example. But once they've done that screen, they can either in addition to that or as for ongoing support, refer into the pathway. So the pilot has been a great success. What I might do is pause and see if Alan wants to reflect any more on the chest, heart, stroke side, but then I can happily come back and start to talk a little bit more about what the findings are emerging from speaking to people who've been through the pathway, but I'll maybe stop at that point.
Thanks, Tim.
Happy to add. I think experience, we're kind of 2 sets of relationships. We've got the relationship we're working with NHS Lothian and Pogo on the digital pathway, and we also, where our teams and advice lender, nurses and their AHP provides a case management service, and that's to provide people with the time and space that perhaps they can't get from the GP because of the pressure on them over a 12-week period, a number of telephone conversations where people have got time to explore with us what's happened in their lives, how they deal with it, be aware, and I guess come to terms with some of the symptoms that emerge from COVID-19. And where appropriate, if they want to continue with this and there's what we continue to do with them, we can refer them on, pass them on to our community support teams or other services within the organisation that fits their particular needs. With I guess with a focus about building confidence and ability for them to take a degree of control of a condition. I think the other side we do is we provide a national helpline where people can call us without referral to, I guess, seek advice and support. So we kind of do two things. One is the case management stuff that we're doing in Parliament with Lothian. The second is the piece we do with where we provide people with a national helpline where they can just call up out of the blue and ask for advice and support. I guess the feedback I get from the team internally and what I hear from the evaluations we've done, initially I think when we set up the helpline is the frustration that people felt they weren't getting the adequate response that they felt they needed from colleagues in the NHS. I think Tim's already explained part of that is that our knowledge and understanding of the condition itself is still emerging. But there's certainly a degree of frustration that's coming our way as an organisation. That's fine. It wasn't unexpected. I think there's still a degree of frustration and concern about that parallel piece that should run alongside what we do as a charity to provide that kind of emotional, practical and social support. The parallel piece that should run around the person's diagnosis and treatment plan that again is still emerging as we learn about the condition. I think we're still getting that fed through to us as a charity. And I think part of it at the start was managing that expectation that what Chest Heart Stroke Scotland weren't doing was replicating clinical management of the condition itself. And there was probably a comms lesson in there for us as an organisation, and certainly a comms lesson in there for partners at the Scottish Government level about how do we ensure that people were aware of what it is we were doing as a partnership. The other thing I would reflect on, Tim's talked about it, is this broader piece about how the third sector can bring their resources and their skill sets into helping resolve not just the issue around how we deal with the pandemic and the longer term impact of the virus, but in a broader sense, how the third sector adds value to the management of long-term conditions in abroad. And I think while there's probably an acceptance at an operational level across the NHS, there's a value to that. There are a number of internal barriers around how the third sector can access and work in partnership to do it. And the biggest one of those, in my experience, the past couple of years has been data sharing and how the NHS gets itself in a position where they can feel comfortable passing on even the smallest amount of information that enables our guys to do their job effectively. Now that still hasn't been resolved. We resolved it in Lothian. It's taken a long time, but we're into these challenges every day. We speak to a health force who want to work with us. So there's a bigger piece in here about the third sector working in harmony with NHS and resolving some of these bureaucratic barriers. Important though data management is, I think there are ways we can resolve this. It doesn't require us to spend 2 years in some situations to come up with data sharing agreements.
Yeah, I think the phrase information governance probably still keeps us all up at night trying to get that done before the pilot kicked off. So Tim, do you want to just quickly please talk through the main findings so far of the pilot and the plans for the future?
Yeah, I'll talk through those. I see there's a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll do my best to address those as well, maybe at the end. So how have we evaluated this? Well, we have data on obviously the number of people have been referred and what their responses to their self-assessment questions have been, and therefore what information they've been provided with. And I think what we're seeing there is what's been found in other studies, which is the prevalent symptoms, which are mainly around fatigue and breathlessness. But interestingly, and I think very relevant, people's concerns, particularly younger people of working age, about return to work and how they approach that when they're struggling, as well as the mental health issues and the brain fog, which links to that in terms of their challenge, dealing with everyday life in the way that they were before. So we've seen that pattern, which essentially is reiterating the problems that people face. What we've done is we've interviewed 15 people in detail who've been through the whole pathway. So their experience of being referred, the process of onboarding themselves. People are automatically sent texts and emails to allow themselves to give consent to be onboarded onto the platform where all the information is and to share their data with chest, heart, and stroke, etc. People have found that pretty universally acceptable. Even older people who are maybe less digitally able than younger people. It's not going to work for everybody, but for the majority of people, they found that process has worked pretty well. And we've supported that with a human, if you like. It's not fully automated, but going forward, we think that will work well. So people will, once referred, quickly be able to get onto the platform, provide their self-assessment, and then receive the information. The value of the talks themselves is generally held to be very high. There were some important observations which we're already putting right, which is at the moment, the initial version in the pilot was the talks were all in visual format. In other words, they were bite-sized chunks that have been designed and written by clinicians on the NHS and CHSS to provide information in digestible format, but it was in a reading format. And we've heard a lot of feedback that people either find that challenging to deal with, given their brain fog, and they would prefer to hear somebody's voice. So we're introducing a read aloud function very soon, so that the talks will read to the people so that they can listen. And also we're introducing a lot more video content in terms of real clinicians talking to the talks, so that it almost feels like, although it's not fully interactive, you're hearing from a clinician and you know what that clinician does. You know, I am a doctor who works here, or I am a member of the CHSS helpline. So that's all coming. I think what we've seen about the content is the majority of people have found it very useful. I think people who perhaps are earlier in their long COVID experience, perhaps are finding, well, I didn't know this. I maybe hadn't had time or hadn't had been able to find this information in the way I needed. And then they're finding that really useful because they feel I can trust this. It's not off a random website or something I've read in the paper or on a Twitter feed. I think it's fair to say we've also seen people who really tried over a longer period to self-manage and help themselves and have done a lot of searching. And I think for those people, they're saying, well, I've seen this before, these talks, and I know this content. And that's good in the sense that they've obviously managed to get that information and hopefully it's been helpful to them, but they're looking for more than that. And so we realized that we want to try and create more content and enable people to search for more content if they need it. But that needs to be a very fine balance between not overwhelming people with too much too soon, where they may just feel, I can't deal with any of this, therefore I don't feel able to use it or engage with it because it's just all overwhelming, which we know is a challenge for some people. In terms of chest, heart, and stroke, I think the feedback has been universally positive. So I think that issue of time, that personal nature, because nearly always it's a single individual they speak to on every occasion, and that very much holistic approach, which is actually what is recommended as the primary management to support people with long COVID at the moment, a holistic approach enabling people to try and manage their condition and their symptoms, because we don't have any magic cures at the moment with a drug or a magical therapy. They just don't exist at the moment for many or most of these. So people have found that universally beneficial, and that was very much the feedback. So the feedback so far has been very good. In terms of next steps, across Lothian, we've now committed to a strategy and now implementing it to roll out the pathway to all GP practices across Lothian. And that will happen over the next 6 to 8 months. We're doing it incrementally because we need to train the general practices. We need to implement the modifications in the pathway some of which I've already mentioned about. And also chest, heart, and stroke have to ensure they have the capacity to deal with that, what we expect to be a significantly increased demand for support over that time. So we plan to roll out across Lothian, and we're in discussions with Scottish Government, which around what strategy Scottish Government will have to have this sort of pathway available to anyone in Scotland. And that's partly a political decision, but obviously the fact that this is linked to Chest, Heart, Stroke Scotland, who Alan may wish to come back and comment on, but I think he did earlier on, is already funded by Scottish Government to provide national support for long COVID. So this seems a very logical way to provide a joined up service across Scotland, and our aim would be to offer spreading of that across Scotland. I noticed, actually, I'll come to Anne Cook in the chat, her comment first. I haven't forgotten the one from Dr. Addy. who obviously has said she gets great benefit from the helpline, but she notes she feels a need a place to go, like a long COVID clinic. And I think we did realize that it's very important with this pathway that patients, when they go to this GP, they need to have that correct signposting that when they're referred onto the pathway, they're not being referred to a face-to-face clinic. They're being referred to self-support management, which will come immediately, and then shortly after that, telephone-based holistic support. What we do recognize that some people who are really struggling with their long COVID, certainly we need to find ways in a coordinated way of connecting them with specialist rehabilitation support. So, and that could be in a number of areas. It could be physiotherapy, it could be mental health support, it could be other things, fatigue management, these sorts of things. And what we plan to do is explore within the NHS, initially across Lothian, how we would link this pathway in a coordinated way with our community services that can manage this. And we're working very closely now with those services to plan how we would do that, whereby the information that had already been gathered on the platform and the support and ongoing referral, for example, to other groups that have been provided by Chest, Heart and Stroke is all brought together so that if certain people need additional specialist support, that information is already available to the people who are then providing that, which obviously will be much more efficient, much more enable those people to be much more personalized. And that information will be gathered on the platform so that we can use that as a way of managing people with long COVID, where any healthcare professional can look in at an individual who's given that permission to share their data and see what their journey has been so far. So that's our way forward. So providing new long COVID clinics is a challenge. And I think there's a lot of debate about whether you try and provide these one-stop-all clinics, or whether if you've provided the support in the way we're proposing have developed, you're actually then sort of triaging people off to the very specific needs they have, depending on what that is, in terms of the symptoms they're really struggling with. So that's the general direction we're planning to develop in, knowing that this is not a problem that's going to go away quickly. I'll just very briefly, if only to say that I'm not the right person to answer this. Dr. Addy raised an interesting point about the sort of what we would medically term the sort of pathophysiology. In other words, what is going on in people's brains that causes brain fog, cognitive problems with their thinking and so on. I'm not personally an expert in that area or a researcher in that area. There is a lot of research going on in that space, and I know that there are studies beginning to show that you can demonstrate changes in people's brains with imaging and things like MRI imaging and so on, that demonstrate that people who are suffering with long COVID do have changes. It's a real condition, we all know that. But I think what we don't know yet, and as I say, I'm not the expert in this area, is exactly what the mechanism of causing that is. And until we understand that, it will be very difficult to start to devise and test what we would call evidence-based treatments, based on what we think the cause is, treatments that might alter that course. So I haven't really answered your question, but hopefully that comment is useful. Many people, some of the people we've interviewed have said it would be helpful on the platform to have more availability of some of these novel findings and therapies. And I think that's something we would consider trying to add in time to the platform, if only that we can provide another trusted resource of, we as doctors or experts, or we've consulted experts, this is what the evidence is saying at the moment, and we'll try and communicate that to you, perhaps through the platform, but we haven't got that at the moment, but it's something we may well consider.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tim, for the detailed answer. And finally, Alan, what are your hopes in the future for when it comes to supporting people with long-term conditions such as long COVID? And then we'll wrap up with any questions.
I think what we've done in Lothian, I'll say, we're the start of a journey here. I think we've made considerable progress over the course of the past few months. We're the start of a journey about how do we integrate care and support across acute primary care and the third sector in a way that adds value and supports people living with, in this case, COVID-19 and long COVID, but potentially how could replicate this particular approach to other conditions. I think I'm enormously hopeful that we're on a journey of ongoing improvement and development. The one thing I think that speaks out of where we have to go next, I think, is understanding and be able to monitor the impact of our interventions and the improvement it has in a person's life. I think the evaluations we've done have given us a real strong evidence base of moving in the right direction. I think the platform itself has to develop into a way where we can monitor people's improvement along that journey, perhaps in a more systematic manner. I think there's a mechanism here, I think, for how do we bring the third sector into the way that the NHS operates, and I think we could potentially be a bit of an exemplar of that. I think there is something from the pandemic that has proven that, although not for everyone, the provision of virtual support does not take away from the quality of experience, I think, of care that we experienced during the pandemic. I think what we're doing is we're building on that. And I think that what we're doing here in Lothing is an example for where we need to go next.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alan. So we'll just take some time. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them out. And obviously, I'd just like to take the time to thank Tim and Alan, who are both two incredibly busy people, for taking an hour out of their schedule to answer our questions and give everyone a picture of how we've been helping patients manage long COVID. So if there's no
question, come in there, Jack. Can I see Robert? I think that's Robert. Yeah, Robert Gregg. I see your comment, Robert, on there. I think it's disappointing people are still finding that some colleagues or other folk don't acknowledge long COVID exists. The only thing I can suggest to you is that for you personally or anyone else on the call is if you are struggling, there's nothing to stop you picking up the phone today and calling chest, heart and stroke. So the pilot we've done, we're opening up to GP practices progressively because we have to manage a process. Otherwise, we'll overwhelm everything and we want to maintain the quality. But if you're frustrated and you want to speak to someone who can go through some support for your long COVID, and you've obviously been to see your GP, which would be a sensible thing to do, you can just go on the Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland website and phone a number today and speak to someone who will essentially provide you with the same support that you would have got if you'd gone through the platform with the pathway. So hopefully that's helpful to you and anyone else who might be on the call with any similar experience.
Well, we have another question from Kathy McLeod. How can other areas services tap into the tailored talks?
Yeah, there we go. We've got the advice line numbers there in the chat already, so that's good. So well, I can take the one for Kathy, and I may have some other comments. I think there might be possibly two ways of looking at your question. There is one is for the long COVID tailored talks, and the other would be for other applications of this pathway, which is what Alan was alluding to, which we're very keen to progress. So if I took the long COVID tailored talks at the moment, my hope is that as we roll out into the full implementation, we will essentially find ways that people can access tailored talks without necessarily going by their GP. If they didn't choose to do that, they can always go to their GP and ask to be referred. Jack may come back in a minute and talk about the app and whether that might be more open source, but there's some challenges with that. But it may well be that certainly within the NHS, we can find other routes for people to access the long COVID resources. And that's something we will explore, but we've, for obvious reasons, focused on primary care routes initially. The other way I might interpret your question was the use of this type of pathway for other long-term conditions, which Alan alluded to. And we're very, very keen to do that. We see that opportunity and the benefits for people of connecting, an excellent charity that provides support in a way very, very different but complementary to the NHS as very, very valuable for other long-term conditions. So we already are developing a lot of materials in the area of stroke and other chronic neurological conditions. We are looking at areas like cancer, where we believe there's a huge opportunity for these similar sorts of pathways, for example, in explaining people's cancer therapy to them in their own time through tailored talks and allowing them to ask questions and potentially give consent and reduce the amount of time they have to sit and travel to hospital and so on, and do a lot of that remotely. And the one we're particularly keen to move forward with next is the management of COPD as a long-term condition, where we see an enormous opportunity there to enable people to connect to us living with COPD, to the tremendous holistic management resources that Chest, Heart and Stroke can provide, but also the self-management resources we could provide through tailored talks in that area. And we're looking at how that pathway might look and designing that content, and again, creating that digital connectedness between the NHS and chest, heart and stroke via POGO. So we're very keen on this model generally as a way forward for managing many conditions.
And it'd be great, Kathy, I'd be more than happy to speak to you about our plans as an organisation. So I've just popped my email in the chat, so please feel free to give me an email. We can get a Teams call in the diary. Brilliant. So that's us ran over by a few minutes, which is always good in a webinar because it means that we've discussed a lot. But I'd just like to thank you all for your time, for coming over, and of course to thank Tim and Alan again, because it's been a really interesting chat we've had. So yeah, please feel free to email me if anyone has any questions. And yeah, have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.